News when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow.
Karen, we begin with new trade uncertainty. A federal appeals court ruled on Friday that President Trump exceeded his authority by imposing global tariffs through an emergency law, but that court is allowing the levies to stay in place while the case proceeds. The court says the statute President Trump used does not explicitly include power to impose tariffs, duties, or taxes, and that Congress did not delegate tariff power to the president. Bloomberg News contributor Rick Davis says the decision extends the suspense over whether the tariffs will ultimately stand.
He likes to show force, right? And the emergency powers gave him that. But he does have other mechanisms to implement some portion of those tariffs. He might not be able to do all of them with every country that he had under a tariff regime.
Yes, right.
But programs like, Section 301 and others give him the ability alone, the power of the executive branch to implement some of those tariffs.
Speaking with Bloomberg's Joe Matthew, Bloomberg News contributor Rick Davis says the Trump administration could potentially turn to the Supreme Court for a final ruling or let the Court of International Trade revisit the matter.
Even after this ruling, Nathan, President Trump said India has offered to eliminate all its tariffs in response to new U.S. trade penalties. Neither the White House nor Indian officials have confirmed any new trade discussions. But this comes days after the White House imposed 50% levies on Indian goods as punishment for its purchases of Russian oil. President Trump's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, is once again attacking Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
It was a shame to see Modi getting in bed as the leader of the biggest democracy in the world with the two biggest authoritarian dictators in the world, in Putin and Xi Jinping. That doesn't make any sense.
White House trade advisor Peter Navarro spoke as Modi declared that India and Russia have a special relationship at the start of a bilateral meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in China.
Well, meanwhile, Karen, Bloomberg News has learned Brazil's president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, plans to convene a virtual meeting of BRICS leaders next week to discuss President Trump's trade policy. Sources tell us Lula is aiming to rally support for multilateralism among fellow emerging market nations. The U.S. has imposed varying tariff rates across the BRICS. Lula reportedly does not want the meeting to turn into an anti-U.S. summit.
Meanwhile, Nathan, back in Washington, Congress is coming back from its summer recess, and the Senate is likely to meet its target to fast-track Stephen Miran's confirmation to the Federal Reserve before its next rate-setting meeting in just over 2 weeks. Bloomberg's Amy Morris has more from Washington.
President Trump appointed Miran to fill the last few months of a term that was unexpectedly vacated by Fed Governor Adriana Kugler. Miran can expect a grilling over Trump's economic policies and efforts to influence the Fed, and could face questions from both Democrats and Republicans. Now, Democrats privately acknowledged they can't block Miran's confirmation on their own, and under the rules, they can only hold it up briefly in the committee, maybe for a few days on the Senate floor. Miran's confirmation hearing is set for Thursday. In Washington, Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Amy, thanks. And before the hearing, current Fed Governor Lisa Cook is still fighting President Trump's bid to oust her. A federal judge spent about 2 hours on Friday questioning lawyers for Cook and the Trump administration on whether the president has cause to fire Cook over allegations of mortgage fraud. The judge ended the hearing without a ruling. Cook's attorneys are expected to file another legal brief today addressing her questions and the administration's arguments.
Well, also happening in D.C., Nathan, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said the Trump administration may declare a national housing emergency this fall. In an interview with the Washington Examiner, Bessent said that housing affordability will be a critical leg of Republicans' 2026 midterm election platform. He declined to list any specific actions the president may take, but suggests the administration is studying ways to standardize local building and zoning codes and decrease closing costs.
Well, let's turn to markets now, Karen. Gold is trading at a record high, driven by expectations of Fed rate cuts and concerns over central bank independence. Gold topped $3,500 an ounce as investors loaded up. The latest run comes after Fed Chair Jay Powell cautiously opened the door to a reduction in his Jackson Hole comments due to a weakening jobs market.
Meanwhile, Nathan, futures are trading lower with the record-breaking stock rally facing its next test later this week with the August jobs report that's due out Friday morning. Former Kansas City Fed President Esther George says a weak number raises the chances of a September rate cut.
The economy looks to be performing pretty good. The decision is, do they see something ahead that suggests the economy will slow in a way, the job market will be damaged in a way that requires them to ease policy, at a time when inflation is holding in there pretty strong.
Former Kansas City Fed President Esther George appeared on Bloomberg television ahead of this Friday's jobs report. And that's news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Karen Moscow.
I'm Nathan Hager, and this is Bloomberg.